Hey there. Tonight we begin with milk, but not the kind that warms a sleepy child or steams gently in a clay mug. This milk was measured, rationed, redirected. In ancient estates, women from the lower classes were hired to nurse noble babies, offering up their bodies for infants with titles, while their own children were left to hunger at home. Their work was intimate, essential, and yet completely disposable. Their breasts fed dynasties, but their names were forgotten. And that was only the beginning. Some women wiped royal backsides in silence. Others stood motionless for hours, used as human coat stands, dressed in rags while holding silks they'd never be allowed to touch. And in the quieter corners of this history, we'll find stories of monastic walls that couldn't keep love from tunneling through stone, and of medieval courtships so strict even eye contact could be treason, where love songs became crimes, and secret weddings took place in barns and outhouses away from the watchful eyes of lords and laws. If these quiet journeys through forgotten history speak to you, a gentle like or subscribe truly means the world. Wherever you're listening from, I'd love to know where in the world you are and what time it is as you drift off. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let's slip into the story together. Imagine having the most sacred part of your body, the part meant to nourish your own child, treated like a rented faucet. Now imagine being told with a straight face that this arrangement was an honor. Welcome to the strange, leaky world of wet nursing in the ancient and medieval eras, where poor women with healthy milk were hired to feed noble babies while their own went hungry or died. It sounds like the plot of a cruel dystopia, but it was very real and very well organized. In elite Roman villas, Ottoman harems, and French palaces, the hiring of wet nurses wasn't just common, it was a competitive business. Noble mothers, you see, couldn't be bothered. Breastfeeding was considered vulgar, inconvenient, and worst of all, bad for your figure. And in an age when fertility was currency, saggy breasts were a deal breaker. So, they delegated. They turned to women from the countryside, strong, fresh, poor, who had just given birth and had the one commodity nobility couldn't manufacture: milk. But this arrangement came with conditions. The peasant woman's own baby taken away, sometimes sent to another village to be wet nursed by someone else even poorer, sometimes left to survive on goat's milk or nothing at all. Maternal instinct didn't matter. What mattered was flow rate, availability, and docility. In 17th century France, entire neighborhoods in Paris outsourced their babies to the countryside. Over 90% of infants in the capital were sent out to be nursed by strangers. Mortality rates soared. Some children never came back. Others returned so late they barely recognized the women who gave birth to them. But in the upper class, this was normal, expected even. It was a system that ran on silence, on the assumption that the wet nurse would absorb both emotional and physical labor without question. And the job wasn't just about milk. It was about submission. Wet nurses were often required to live in the noble household, to be on call day and night, to feed the child on demand, cuddle them, soothe them, becoming the baby's real mother in every way but name. But when the child grew, guess who got erased from the family painting? Contracts were drawn, payments delayed. Wet nurses who got sick or complained could be dismissed instantly. And if a noble baby fell ill, or worse, died, the blame often fell squarely on the nurse. In some places they were fined. In others they were shunned or punished. The grief wasn't even theirs to feel, just their failure to prevent. It gets darker. In some elite circles, particularly in Renaissance Italy and Bourbon France, women were selected not just for milk quality, but for their looks and temperament. The belief was that a wet nurse's mood could taint the child. A melancholy woman might produce a melancholy baby, a talkative woman, a future gossip. So interviews were conducted, teeth examined, character references checked, not for a teaching post, but for a milk job. Nobility wanted compliant, cheerful women with symmetrical faces and soft voices. In essence, emotionally available laborers who knew when to disappear. And they did. Their names were rarely recorded, their faces blurred into the background of portraits. If they were lucky, they got a small pension or a bundle of coins. If
Were unlucky, they left with less than they came, less milk, less strength, sometimes no child to return to. What's remarkable is how often this system was portrayed as kindness. At least she's getting paid, was the logic. She's being cared for. But paid how? In irregular installments. Cared for by whom? By the very households who saw her as an udder with legs. And even when the work was over, the stigma followed. Former wet nurses were sometimes avoided by men who feared milk contamination, as if nurturing a noble infant made them somehow unclean. And yet, despite all this, the work continued quietly, desperately, generationally. Mothers fed children who were not their own so that their families might eat. They handed over their bodies for survival, and they bore the emotional consequences in silence. Many never recovered from the separation from their own babies. Some tried to return home only to find illness or death waiting. Others never returned at all. You can almost hear the system defending itself. But the babies lived. Yes, the right babies, the chosen ones, the ones whose first sip of life came not from their mother, but from a stranger who couldn't afford to say no. And this raises a strange, bitter question. When does nurturing stop being a gift and become exploitation? When does care, sold and scripted, lose its humanity? The answer, it seems, lies in the details, in the contracts written in ink, the babies lost in the countryside, and the women who rocked children that would never know their name. We often think of love and motherhood as sacred, but history, ever the quiet disruptor, reminds us that even milk, even something as natural and life-giving as breastfeeding, can be twisted into a service, a symbol, a sacrifice, especially when the bodies offering it belong to the voiceless. Let's begin with a job title that didn't make it into many fairy tales: the groom of the stool. Now, take that already uncomfortable image, a nobleman's backside in someone else's hands, and give it a twist. In some royal courts and noble houses, especially where modesty was a slippery suggestion, it wasn't always men who handled the wiping. In the right time, the right culture, and the wrong birth class, there were women, actual women, hired, assigned, or born into the task of managing someone else's most undignified moments. No, they didn't wear gloves. Yes, they had cloths. And if you're wondering whether this was a respected position or just the last available job in a plague-ravaged economy, the answer is somehow both. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, cleanliness was next to godliness, but only when performed by someone else. Royalty didn't scrub their own skin, change their own clothes, or, heaven forbid, reach for their own wiping cloths. For the highest nobles, defecation wasn't private, it was curated. And in the stratified ecosystem of a palace, even bowel movements required choreography. There were high-ranking male courtiers, the grooms of the stool in England, whose duties included managing the king's chamber pot and wiping as needed. But in many lesser-known households across Europe and Asia, especially in women's quarters, the same task was silently delegated to other women. These weren't medical assistants. They were maids, servants, concubines, or slaves chosen for their quietness, their low rank, and often their availability. Think about what this means. A noblewoman sits. A servant kneels. Between them, centuries of hierarchy and a damp linen cloth. And it wasn't always just about the physical task. Sometimes these women were expected to examine the excrement, looking for signs of illness, undigested pearl dust, or whatever strange tonics their mistress had swallowed the night before. In effect, they were both toilet paper and diagnostic tool. And then came the silence. No one talked about them. They appear in almost no records, no paintings, no diaries, not because the work was rare, but because it was embarrassing, too intimate to acknowledge, yet too essential to skip. In Eastern empires, such as the Ottoman court, eunuchs and concubines shared these duties. In Chinese palaces, imperial maids handled the waste of empresses and royal children with clinical regularity and zero recognition. Their names, if remembered at all, came up only in scandal, if they spoke too freely or dared to joke about what they saw. In the West, similar patterns played out in noble houses, where women were surrounded by handmaids from childhood. These handmaids were expected to wash, wipe, and carry the chamber pot away with grace, discretion, and no facial expression. It was service, yes, but it was also submission. When your job is to clean another woman's filth, the message is clear. Your body is worth less than hers. And yet, perversely, some of these roles were considered trusted positions. After all, you had to be close. You had to be quiet. You had to know the rhythms of your mistress's body. You were the first to know when she was pregnant, or ill, or had indulged too heavily at dinner. You saw her at her most human and had to pretend she was divine. One slip of the tongue and you were gone. Not fired, erased, replaced, forgotten. Because no queen, duchess, or noble lady wanted the world to remember that behind every perfumed gown and powdered wig, someone else had to get their hands dirty. Literally. And here's the twist. Many of these women weren't paid in gold or gratitude. They were compensated in leftover food, shared bedding, or vague promises. Occasionally, a mistress might reward a particularly loyal attendant with a second-hand necklace or an old dress, a gesture that seemed generous until you realized it came after years of wiping someone else's behind without complaint. We often talk about invisible labor, but this was invisibility by design, a system that needed your body but erased your name, a world where the line between intimacy and degradation blurred so thoroughly it vanished. What did this do to a person's sense of self? Imagine spending your youth in someone's shadow, not metaphorically, but literally. Crouch behind them as they relieve themselves, expected to wipe, clean, and smile. Imagine aging out of the role not with retirement or honor, but with a quiet dismissal and no references, because who would hire a woman whose only skill was enduring someone else's private mess? There's a reason we don't see this job on any lineage trees. No one brags, my great-great-grandmother wiped a duchess. And yet, without these women,
elegance of the court would collapse. You can't host a ball if your noble guests are reeking. You can't maintain royal mystique if you're caught fumbling with your own chamber pot. Systems, especially those built on appearances, need someone to manage the underside. And in palace after palace, century after century, that someone was a quiet woman with a cloth. Even now, the thought makes us shift in our seats. It's uncomfortable, undignified, which is exactly why it deserves to be remembered. Because history isn't just the crowns and titles and victories. It's also the people who held the basin, washed the sheets, and wiped the skin no one else dared to touch. You can tell a lot about a society by who holds the weight, literally. And in certain royal courts, especially in late medieval and Renaissance Europe, the answer wasn't metaphorical. It was shockingly, silently literal. Some women were employed, or ordered, to stand still for hours, holding coats, cloaks, jewelry, or accessories like beautiful breathing furniture. They weren't helping someone dress. They were the wardrobe itself. The term living mannequin might conjure images of high fashion and Parisian catwalks, but this wasn't glamorous. This was a woman, often young and silent, standing bare-armed in a corner of a noble's dressing room, holding a fur-lined robe across her outstretched arms until her shoulders went numb. Sometimes she held gloves, sometimes swords, sometimes a gilded hat box with nothing inside but someone else's vanity. Her job was not to speak, not to slouch, and above all, not to exist beyond her function. In the Elizabethan court, young ladies in waiting were expected to assist the queen with dressing. But assist didn't mean what you think. It meant standing in decorative silence as each layer was added. The garments passed from one pair of hands to another like sacred relics. These women were positioned, posed, and choreographed not for efficiency, but for spectacle. Their presence was part of the royal performance, a visual affirmation of hierarchy. one body clothed in riches, the others holding them. And if you think this sounds theatrical, that's because it was. Courts operated like slow, never-ending plays. And in these plays, someone always had to play the furniture. In some Italian duchies, young noble women in training were made to practice this role, not just for minutes, but for hours, balancing trays of jewels or linens, their arms trembling, faces blank. The idea was to train them in grace under burden, a euphemism for being decorative and useful while also quietly invisible. And if they fainted, well, perhaps they weren't cut out for court life. There were also servants assigned this role full-time, women whose main job was to hold the cape, dust the shoulder, and wait. Sometimes they were expected to hold multiple garments at once, each perfectly arranged and wrinkle-free. They stood behind dressing screens or beside doorways, part of the room's architecture. And no, they weren't given stools. Sitting was a luxury. The garments sat. The women stood. This wasn't unique to Europe. In Chinese and Japanese courts, similarly, aesthetic roles existed. Palace maids who acted as ornamental attendants, positioned strategically during public appearances or rituals. Their beauty was part of the illusion. Their silence was part of the contract. And it wasn't just the physical weight. It was the emotional burden of being present and ignored. You might spend your entire day surrounded by silk, gold thread, and perfume, none of which was yours. You might be within whispering distance of royalty, yet never spoken to directly. Your face was visible, your voice erased. At what point does being seen without being acknowledged become its own kind of punishment? The irony here is sharp. These women were used to display wealth, but their own labor was never valued. They held up capes that cost more than they'd earn in a lifetime. They balanced tiaras they could never wear. They were expected to admire beauty while knowing it would never be theirs. They were the stagehands of elegance, perfectly lit, perfectly silent. And yes, it was humiliating, but not in the way we usually imagine. There were no jeers, no shouts, just the long, slow erosion of personhood, a kind of stillness that devours you from the inside out. In some cases, noble women themselves were turned into props, especially at weddings, banquets, or diplomatic events. A visiting ambassador might enter a chamber to find a row of ladies in waiting, dressed identically, each holding a gift or garment as if plucked from a painting. Their stillness wasn't optional, it was rehearsed, and behind their quiet smiles there was often pain. Backaches, headaches, even dislocated joints from holding positions too long without relief. One woman, a minor duchess's attendant in the 1500s, was recorded in a physician's notes after collapsing during a reception. She had stood for 6 hours holding a satin-lined cape, afraid to shift her weight, because it might rustle the fabric and cause offense. The doctor was baffled by her symptoms: faintness, dizziness, and partial paralysis in one arm. Today we'd call it nerve compression. Back then they called it hysteria. And let's not forget what happened when these living mannequins aged out of their usefulness. Youth was part of the role. If your skin lost its glow, your hands trembled, or your back hunched, you were quietly reassigned, often to laundry duty, or worse, dismissed entirely, because no one wants to see the coat rack crumble. So why did this system endure? Because it worked. It reinforced who mattered. It reminded everyone that status wasn't just worn, it was held, literally by someone else. And the more elaborate the fashion, the more hands required to support it. We remember the gowns, the portraits, the sparkle. But rarely do we ask who held the train of that dress. Who kept the sleeves wrinkle-free while the lady flirted across the ballroom? Who disappeared behind the curtain, arms sore, waiting to be called again? In history's great theater of power, someone always plays the silent part. Someone always holds the weight without applause. Some people go into acting, others into hospitality, and some, through no real choice of their own, become experts in theatrical grief. not because their hearts are broken, but because someone paid them to sound like it was. Across ancient Egypt, Greece, China, and far into the medieval world, professional mourning wasn't just a strange side hustle. It was a recognized job, a choreographed performance, a contract for your tears. Families, especially wealthy ones, would hire women, and it was almost always women, to cry, scream, tear their hair, and beat their chests during funerals. The louder the better. The more dramatic, the more convincing. But these weren't mourners in the way we understand the word. They weren't there because they knew the deceased. They were there because the family needed volume. In grief, as in life, social status required noise. And silence, especially at a funeral, could be interpreted as shame, guilt, or worse, irrelevance. So women were summoned, sometimes widows, sometimes spinsters, sometimes just desperate. They arrived in black veils or ragged gowns, prepared to wail at command. And they did, with stunning stamina. For hours they circled the coffin, cried out the deceased's virtues, real or imagined, called to the heavens, screamed to the underworld. Some fainted dramatically, others scratched their faces until blood mixed with mascara. And here's the surreal part. These performances often took place beside real mourners, the wife, the children, the shell-shocked friends. Imagine standing beside your mother's coffin, trying to hold yourself together, while three strangers shriek so loudly you can't hear your own thoughts. Imagine watching a woman you've never seen before clutch your uncle's lifeless hand and sob, "Why did you leave us, oh beloved lion of the valley?" And you're thinking, he sold fish and cheated at cards. In ancient Rome, laws eventually had to be passed limiting the number of professional mourners at funerals, not out of morality, but out of noise complaints. The grief industry had grown too competitive. If one family hired 5 criers, the neighbor had to hire 7. Then came dancers, flute players, even acrobats. And somewhere buried beneath the chaos was the actual body. In Egypt, professional mourners were often chosen based on their resemblance to the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, divine sisters who wept at Osiris's tomb. These women weren't just performers, they were religious symbols. Their wailing was sacred, their pain mythological. But behind the ritual was a painful truth. They were still hired help. Their emotions didn't belong to them, they belonged to the script. And the payment? It varied. Some were given coins, others bread or wine. In some cases, they received cast-off clothes, the dead person's robe perhaps. A strange inheritance for a stranger's grief. And once the funeral ended, they were expected to disappear. No thank you, no meal, just walk out, wash your face, and wait for the next death notice. There's something deeply disorienting about this. On one hand, these women gave society a way to process collective sorrow, to ritualize the inexpressible. On the other hand, they were often mocked, mistrusted, or seen as a nuisance. Too loud, too fake, too much. The perfect scapegoat for the awkwardness of death. And yet, it was a job, one of the few available to poor, unmarried, or socially discarded women. You didn't need literacy or connections, just a voice that could rise like a siren and fall into sobs on cue. Your pain didn't have to be real, but it had to sound real. That was the line between employment and humiliation. But of course, the line was blurry. What happens when you cry long enough for pay that you forget what real tears feel like? What does it do to a person to scream at the top of her lungs beside someone she's never met, and do it again
and again, until grief becomes choreography? There were even punishments for failing to mourn correctly. In certain Chinese dynasties, if a professional mourner was caught laughing or gossiping during a wake, she could be beaten or publicly shamed, because her sadness was no longer her own. It was rented, regulated, rated by the family for realism. And yet, in some corners, mourners were respected. In parts of rural India and Eastern Europe, women who specialized in funeral laments, known as weeping singers, were treated as keepers of tradition. They carried stories, customs, genealogies in their cries. But even then, they were often excluded from polite society. People needed them, but didn't want to be them. That's the contradiction at the heart of it. These women were necessary, but invisible, revered, but disposable, expected to cry like family, but treated like furniture. They were the soundtrack of death, queued up, played loud, and faded out. And if they ever got too good at their job, people grew suspicious. She's enjoying it, some would whisper. She cries too well, as if real emotions should be messy, uncontrolled, and unemployable. We like to think grief is sacred, that mourning is personal, but history suggests otherwise. When a culture values appearances more than feelings, even sorrow becomes something to outsource. So the next time you see a statue of a grieving woman, hair loose, head thrown back, mouth open in an eternal wail, ask yourself, was she mourning or working? Because sometimes the loudest cry at the funeral wasn't for the dead, but for the living, still trying to afford their silence. And just beyond that tale lies another, waiting quietly in the dark. If you've ever scribbled a note in the back of a textbook, a secret crush, a doodle, something your teacher wasn't supposed to see, then you already understand the strange intimacy of writing where you're not supposed to. Now raise the stakes. Make the book a Bible. Make the reader a monk. Make the consequences eternal damnation, or at least public flogging. Welcome to the quiet, ink-stained corners of the cloister, where forbidden love didn't shout, it whispered from between the lines of Holy Scripture. In medieval Europe, monasteries and convents weren't just religious sanctuaries, they were also emotional pressure cookers. Men and women took vows of chastity, silence, obedience, and then spent years, sometimes decades, living in close proximity to others doing the same. They shared meals, prayers, chores, and above all, loneliness. And loneliness, as it turns out, is fertile soil for longing. So they wrote. Not openly, not in love letters sealed with wax and sprayed with perfume. No, these were whispers in the margins, literal marginalia, a single Latin word tilted sideways, a smudge that meant, I saw you, a psalm with slightly darker ink because the monk who copied it was thinking of someone else entirely. In some monasteries, scholars have found phrases like, remember me, or I suffer in silence, tucked between lines of scripture. A few even dared to sketch eyes, lips, initials intertwined with vines. It wasn't graffiti, it was confession. Not to God, but to someone who might someday, somehow understand. These weren't one-off rebellions. In some cases, full correspondences developed, passed from hand to hand in shared prayer books, or etched into wax tablets briefly before being smoothed over. Two lovers might write to each other for months, hidden behind the polite veil of illuminated manuscripts. Every psalm became a metaphor, every lamentation a love song. And yes, sometimes they quoted scripture, not for piety, but for coded affection. Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb, took on layered meanings. The risk was enormous. In many orders, even speaking to someone of the opposite sex outside designated moments was forbidden. Being caught exchanging personal notes could mean being whipped, isolated, or even expelled. Worse, it could mean forced relocation, ripped from the only person who made the cloister bearable. But the risk for some was part of the appeal. When your entire life is structured, every meal, every breath, every thought assigned a time and place, then doing something small and unsanctioned feels like freedom. A note in the margin is not just love, it's rebellion with a quill. One famous case comes from 12th century France, the doomed love between Eloise and Abelard. Though they weren't monastics when they met, they were scholars bound by religious expectation. Their letters, many of which survive, show a passion that had to twist itself into theological arguments just to be allowed on paper.
God knows, Eloise once wrote, I never sought in you but yourself. For those in cloisters, the love was no less real, just quieter. A flicker of a glance during morning mass, a brush of hands as bread was passed, a small, dangerous note that read, Only I prayed for you. Sometimes the margins themselves became safer than speech. The spoken word fades, ink does not. Even centuries later, historians stumble.
Harboring romantic feelings, whether toward a fellow sister, a visitor, or even a vague figure in her dreams, might be whipped with rods, paraded barefoot through the cloister, or made to fast in solitude for weeks. One recorded punishment in 15th century France involved a young sister being forced to sleep on the chapel floor for 40 nights with only a thin linen shift and no blanket. It was winter. The logic? Let the body freeze. Maybe then the heart will cool too. Men were not spared. Monks who broke celibacy vows or were merely suspected of it might be chained in underground cells, subjected to public beatings, or reassigned to harsher posts. One particularly cruel case from a Carthusian order in Germany involved a monk being forced to transcribe every psalm that referenced purity by hand hundreds of times while fasting on bread and water. He lost most of his eyesight. The abbot commended his redemption. But here's the cruel twist. The punishments weren't about extinguishing desire, they were about exposing it, making it visible, making it grotesque. When love becomes spectacle, it stops being personal. It becomes a cautionary tale, a grim little play put on for the benefit of others so they'll know what happens when you reach for something you were never supposed to want. And that's why the punishment so often came with an audience. A letter read aloud, a diary page confiscated and quoted by a superior, a dream confessed in private that became public the next day. These weren't just betrayals of privacy, they were systemic performances, the act of making someone's yearning, their most human instinct, into a communal shame ritual. In some convents, sisters were ordered to beat the penitent with birch twigs, not violently, but ritually. The message was clear: we do this because we love you, because we must help you love less. It's hard to imagine the heartbreak, being punished not because you acted, but because you felt, because your body reminded you it was alive. And the worst part, you were often required to participate in your own humiliation, to recite prayers aloud while kneeling, to carry a wooden cross in a circle, to strike your own chest and say, mea culpa, my fault, as if desire itself was an infection only you carried. One abbey record in 1322 tells of a young nun who kissed another sister on the hand during a night prayer vigil. She was 16. The kiss was seen by a lay sister who reported it. The punishment? A public whipping in the refectory, while the other sister watched, weeping, but forbidden to intervene. The kissing nun was then forbidden from speaking to anyone for a month. No words, not even in prayer. Imagine what that does to a soul. But of course, the real purpose wasn't correction, it was erasure. Not just of behavior, but of memory. Institutions panic when individuals start forming attachments that don't serve the system. Romantic love that creates bonds that might challenge obedience, that might give someone the courage to leave, or worse, to think for themselves. So they responded with fire and frost, whips for the body, silence for the heart, and cold floors for the dreams. There's an eerie echo of this even today. The idea that some kinds of love must be hidden, controlled, or punished, that what the heart wants is something to be managed, not honored. History doesn't just tell us what happened, it shows us what terrified those in power, and what terrified them most, more than heresy, more than rebellion, was intimacy. Because intimacy rewrites the rules. It reminds people they are more than function, more than uniform. It offers a mirror that says, I see you, not as Sister Magdalena or Brother Paul, but as you. And for institutions built on sameness, that kind of seeing is dangerous. We like to think of monks and nuns as serene figures in stained glass, serene, pious, asexual. But peel back the layers and you find real people wanting, failing, reaching, and being punished not because they betrayed God, but because they dared to remember they were human. So the next time someone tells you history is dry, just dates and doctrines, remind them that once someone wept through lashes, not because they sinned, but because they loved, and history punished them for it. Saints, we're told, are the spotless ones, chaste, pious, radiant in stained glass, unbothered by earthly things like desire, confusion, or attraction. But if you flip far enough back in the history books, the pages that haven't been gilded or censored, you start to see a different picture. Saints who felt things, saints who fell in love, saints who maybe didn't stay all that saintly, and then saints who were edited, because holiness, as it turns out, has a PR department. Let's begin with Saint Pelagia of Antioch, depending on which century you're reading from. Pelagia was either a repentant harlot who flung her jewels into the sea, or a theater dancer so seductive men followed her down alleyways. But dig deeper, and you'll find a version where she may have had a lover, a bishop no less, before fleeing to the desert to become a hermit. Later chroniclers quietly removed that detail. Too messy, too mortal. Better to let her sparkle like a tearful moral than as a woman. She wasn't the only one. Take Saint Margaret of Cortona, born in 13th century Italy. She lived openly with a nobleman for years, had a child out of wedlock, and wasn't particularly ashamed of either. But after her lover was mysteriously murdered, she joined the Franciscans and became known for her penitence. The early biographies include her grief, not just for sin, but for love lost. Later ones lean harder on the sin, the affection cropped out like an inconvenient background object in a painting. It's a pattern. In medieval Europe, canonization wasn't just about virtue. It was about narrative control. The church needed figures who inspired, but inspiration was most effective when squeaky clean. Any rough edges, especially romantic ones, had to be sanded down. That's how St. Clare's deep emotional bond with St. Francis of Assisi was reframed as spiritual admiration despite letters that hint at something more tangled, and how St. Ethrith of Ely, who was married twice but insisted on perpetual virginity, had her relationships reframed as triumphs of abstinence, even though at least one husband wasn't exactly thrilled about it. The most striking case, St. Augustine. Yes, that Augustine, theologian, bishop, church father. He had a mistress, lived with her for over a decade, had a son, named him, loved him deeply, and when Augustine converted, he didn't pretend it didn't happen. He wrote about it, regretted it, missed it, wrote of longing and loss. But centuries later, sermons and adaptations would skim that part, turn the mistress into a vague youthful temptation. Because saints are meant to rise, not ache. But the edits weren't just about modesty, they were strategic. By purifying the past, the church could offer cleaner models. Saints became templates, tools, prototypes of how you were supposed to behave, not how people actually did. And love, especially romantic love, was tricky, too messy, too distracting, easier to canonize a martyr, burned at the stake, than a woman once whispered in the dark to someone she wasn't supposed to want. So what did they do? They scrubbed. Scribes rewrote, biographers embellished or erased, diaries were translated with modesty adjustments, whole paragraphs vanished, and in some cases relationships were recast as visions, temptations, or divine tests. If a saint had deep affection for another person, it became a spiritual bond. If they exchanged letters, those were epistles. And if they confessed their longing, it was reframed as a metaphor for longing for God. This wasn't malice. It was marketing. And like all good marketing, it left a legacy. For centuries, believers looked up to these pure saints, never knowing that behind the halos were real people, often conflicted, sometimes lovesick, occasionally impulsive. Saints who cried not just from devotion, but from missing someone they weren't supposed to love. It makes you wonder what's more inspiring, a saint who never felt anything, or one who struggled and still chose the path of meaning. Because love doesn't cancel holiness. It complicates it, makes it human. And that's what these stories, in their unedited forms, reveal. Saints weren't statues, they were souls. Some of them burned with love, some tried to hide it, some failed, and some we only know about because a margin note escaped the senses. But make no mistake, many didn't escape. Entire generations grew up worshiping versions of people that never really existed, idolizing perfection that was manufactured, not lived. And in doing so, they were taught that love, desire, even partnership were liabilities to the soul. It's a cruel paradox. The very thing that makes us feel most alive, most connected, was framed as what might damn us. But history, like love, has a long memory, and sometimes beneath the gold leaf and incense, you can still find the truth in a scribbled confession, a hidden letter, a lost biography, signs that even the
Saints in their most sacred moments were sometimes just people trying to make sense of love and longing. So next time you see a statue in a cathedral, serene, distant, unbothered, remember, someone probably edited out the part where they once blushed or waited for a letter or stood too long near someone whose name no longer appears in the official records. And maybe, just maybe, that makes them even more holy. And just when you thought it couldn't get stranger, well, history has more to offer. Modern weddings, with their signature cocktails and chaotic toasts, like to talk about love. But if you'd walked into a royal marriage in the medieval or early modern world and used that word, someone might have dropped their goblet from laughter, not sentiment. Because love, that was a luxury. Marriage, especially among nobility, was about power. And power didn't like to wander too far from the family tree, so it stayed in the family, literally. Brother to cousin, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, in some cases, sister to half-brother. If it sounds uncomfortable, that's because it was. But in the eyes of ruling dynasties, it made perfect sense. Why risk your precious land, crown, or political leverage on outsiders when you could marry someone whose bloodline already matched your coat of arms? Blood was currency, and keeping it pure meant not sharing it with people who didn't already swim in the same gene pool. The Egyptians were famous for this. Pharaohs often married their sisters not out of romantic desire, but because the divine right to rule had to remain in the same vessel. Gods didn't marry strangers, after all. They recycled their divinity, and the humans who ruled in their names followed suit. Centuries later, European royalty kept the tradition alive in their own restrained, disturbingly polite way. The Habsburgs of Spain and Austria were perhaps the most notorious. Their family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a coiled spring. Generation after generation, cousins married cousins. The result? A genetic bottleneck so severe that by the time Charles II of Spain was born, he had a lower jaw so pronounced he couldn't chew properly, and a lineage so interwoven it's a statistical miracle he survived childhood at all. But Charles II wasn't just a footnote in genetic textbooks. He was a symbol of what happened when dynasties prioritized inheritance over health, name over nature. And the kicker? Even then, the practice didn't stop because the stakes were too high. Marrying an outsider, someone without noble blood, risked dilution. Worse, it meant sharing power with a new family, which meant new loyalties, new ambitions, maybe even revolution. So, instead, they kept it close. Marriages were contracts, strategic alliances, the exchange of titles and territory dressed in lace and uncomfortable smiles. Romance had no seat at the table. If a royal fell in love with someone unsuitable, a maid, a soldier, a poet, the best they could hope for was a quiet affair and a bastard child with a noble surname and no claim to anything. In many cases, the partners didn't even speak the same language until after the wedding. A French princess sent to Spain might be 15, barely literate, and married to a man twice her age with a love for falconry and gout. Her job was simple: bear heirs, secure the line, stay quiet, and if she couldn't do that, well, the family had cousins, always more cousins. But the practice wasn't confined to Europe or Egypt. In the Inca Empire, royal siblings married to preserve sacred bloodlines said to descend from the sun god. In ancient Persia, the Achaemenid rulers encouraged marriage between close relatives to consolidate both political and religious authority. Everywhere you looked, where power clung to blood, love had to pack its bags. To be clear, this wasn't the product of ignorance. Rulers weren't unaware of the dangers of inbreeding. By the late Middle Ages, enough shriveled lineages and disturbingly frail heirs had made the risks clear. But power is rarely rational. It's paranoid. And paranoia doesn't like outsiders. Even the church, that grand moral compass, got involved, but not in the way you might hope. Yes, technically, cousin marriage was banned, but a papal dispensation, essentially a religious permission slip, could be purchased if the match was politically advantageous enough. God, it seems, was willing to negotiate. And so the cycles continued. Families tightened their circles, and love, that wild, unpredictable thing, was seen not as sacred, but as subversive. This doesn't mean no royal ever loved their spouse. Some did. A few even found companionship or affection after years of awkward silence and dynastic duty. But more often, love had to be exiled, a guest too disruptive to be seated next to the inheritance table. And what did this do to the people involved? It turned them into symbols, living avatars of treaties and alliances. Their bodies became political tools, whose hands they held, whose beds they shared, whose children they produced, all part of the state machine. Some endured it. Some rebelled quietly with secret affairs or stony silences. Others simply faded, forgotten queens with titles but no stories, forgotten dukes who lived short, sad lives in ornate rooms with too many mirrors and too few choices. And what did it do to the idea of marriage itself? It reduced it, shrunk it into something brittle, something that looked grand from a distance, all pearls and procession, but up close was mostly paperwork and pressure. So the next time someone tells you that love and marriage always went hand in hand, remember, for centuries, marriage was less about love than containment, a tool to keep power within walls, a gate to keep the world and all its inconvenient feelings firmly outside. And if love ever did sneak in, it had to wear a disguise, speak in whispers, and pray no one saw it standing beside the family tree with pruning shears. If you've ever stared at a royal portrait and thought, why does that guy look like someone sculpted him out of wax and forgot to finish the chin? You might have met a Habsburg. The Habsburg dynasty, rulers of Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and various territories across Europe for over 600 years, wasn't just powerful. It was determined to keep that power locked within its own bloodstream, even if that meant marrying the same people over and over until their family tree looked like a spiral staircase. To call it inbreeding is accurate. To call it extreme might be generous. Let's talk about Charles II of Spain, the unfortunate final product of generations of Habsburg dedication to keeping it in the family. His pedigree reads like a tragic joke. His father was also his mother's uncle. His grandparents were also cousins. By the time Charles arrived, the genetic coefficient of inbreeding, a fancy term for how much DNA did he inherit from the same ancestor twice, was over 25%. For comparison, that's higher than the theoretical result of sibling marriage, and the effects showed. Charles had the infamous Habsburg jaw, a dramatically extended lower mandible so pronounced he couldn't chew properly and spoke with difficulty. He had developmental delays, frequent seizures, and was largely infertile. His autopsy noted that his heart was the size of a walnut, his lungs were corroded, and he had just one shrunken testicle. He died childless at 38, the last of his Spanish line. He wasn't just an individual with medical issues. He was the human receipt of a centuries-long dynasty experiment in genetic monopoly. The Habsburgs weren't blind to what was happening, but they were committed. You don't build an empire without a little selective blindness. Over the years, they justified the consanguineous marriages, that's the polite term, with theological flair. God, after all, blessed their line, and keeping power among the faithful, even if those faithful were first cousins, was seen as both divine and politically necessary. And so they married close, very close. Between 1450 and 1750, over 80% of Habsburg marriages were between relatives. This wasn't just convenience, it was doctrine. The goal was to consolidate claims, unify territories, and avoid legal disputes. It was cheaper to marry your niece than to go to war over a border. And if the resulting children had a few wit quirks, that was seen as the price of unity. The infamous Habsburg jaw, technically known as mandibular prognathism, became a recognizable brand as distinctive as their crests. It didn't just show up in Charles II, it appeared in portraits of Maximilian I, Philip IV, and even female members like Maria Anna. In many royal paintings, their elongated jaws and heavy lower lips became symbols of identity, not embarrassment. But behind those paintings were very real struggles. Difficulty speaking, inability to eat solid food, breathing problems, fertility issues. Many Habsburgs suffered in silence, not because no one noticed, but because to admit the cost was to question the system. And questioning the system, that was treason. Medical historians today point out that the dynasty's decline was as much biological as political.
As the generations went on, health declined sharply. Infant mortality rose, mental health issues became more visible, decision-making suffered, and when Charles II died without an heir, Europe plunged into the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal multi-nation conflict triggered by the failure of one man's tragically inbred body to produce a child. That's the twist. All the inbreeding meant to prevent war ultimately led to one of the bloodiest European conflicts of the era. The gene pool didn't just stagnate, it backfired. And yet, it's important to understand the logic, not just the outcome. The Habsburgs weren't cartoon villains. They were playing by the rules of dynastic power. Keep the bloodline clean, protect titles, avoid external alliances that could challenge sovereignty. They were operating within a world where marriage wasn't romantic, it was strategic infrastructure. And the tighter the circle, the less likely power would leak. But biology doesn't care about politics. It's not impressed by empires. And when the same genes get copied and pasted enough times, the errors start to stack up. In private, some Habsburg advisors began to suggest diversifying the gene pool, marrying into other noble houses, even foreign ones, to restore health. But those suggestions were often dismissed or delayed or buried under papal dispensations and thick family pride. And so the portraits continued, and so did the jaws. There's a bitter kind of irony here. A family so obsessed with control over legacy ended up remembered less for their politics than for their deformities. Their very bodies became historical warnings. But perhaps what's most haunting is this. For centuries, those marriages were seen as normal, even admirable. The system didn't hide them, it celebrated them. Lavish weddings, wool-threaded robes, painted oaths and parchment scrolls. Underneath it all, a slow genetic collapse. History often talks about war, conquest, and betrayal, but sometimes it's love or the strategic absence of it that does the quietest damage. So, next time you see a grand family portrait from a European palace, look closer. Behind the silks and jewels, you might spot a crooked jaw, a tired gaze, a family stitched so tightly together that they forgot how to breathe. And perhaps the saddest part, no one ever told them to stop, because power, once it gets used to itself, never thinks it might be part of the problem. We tend to think of royal children as lucky, born into palaces, dressed in brocade, surrounded by tutors, nannies, and adoring courtiers. But peel back the velvet curtains, and you'll find something quieter, sadder, and far heavier. Because many royal children weren't born free. They were born burdened, not with toys or tantrums, but with titles, expectations, and a list of political responsibilities long before they learned to walk. They were infants with scepters, toddlers with signatures, tiny mouths full of milk and monarchies. Sometimes the titles came at birth: Duke of Normandy, Infante of Castile, Prince of the Blood. The words sounded grand, but they were really contracts, silent oaths that the child's body now belonged to history, not to themselves. And sometimes these children were heirs to multiple thrones. Thanks to cousin marriages and dynastic alliances, a single child might be the future king of this, duke of that, margrave of something else, all by age 5. Which meant one thing: they couldn't fail, they couldn't fall ill, they couldn't be too quiet or too playful or too ordinary, because the weight of entire empires sat on their shoulders even before their spine had finished forming. Take the case of King Ladislaus the Posthumous. He was born 1440, 3 months after his father died. His inheritance? The crowns of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia. That's right, he was king before he was even born. His arrival into the world came with courtiers squabbling, regents scheming, and everyone fighting over who would rule in his name. His childhood wasn't measured in years, but in documents signed by other people. He died at 17, poisoned, possibly without ever really being in. Or consider Charles, the child king of Navarre, who became monarch at just 1 year old. He held the title, but not the power. That belonged to the adults circling him. Relatives, advisors, guardians, each pulling a string, speaking for him, ruling through him. His job was to stay alive and look regal, even in a cradle. Royal childhood was not childhood as we know it. Play was structured, lessons began early, and emotion best kept hidden. Smiling too much? Undignified. Crying in public? A diplomatic incident. These children grew up learning that their feelings were secondary, that a misstep wasn't a family matter, it was a national concern. And if they struggled, well, many did. Some cracked under the pressure. Others withdrew. Still others were quietly replaced, a younger sibling groomed instead, especially if the firstborn seemed too soft. There are whispers of heirs who were deemed unfit and shunted off to countryside estates, their names removed from official records, their titles and their burdens handed to the next in line. Even the successful ones paid a price. Think of Louis XVII of France, the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. After their parents were executed during the French Revolution, the monarchy's supporters declared the little boy the rightful king at just 8 years old. He was imprisoned, abused, and left to rot in a dark cell. By the time he died at age 10, his body was covered in sores. His autopsy revealed he had suffered years of neglect and disease, but in the eyes of royalists, he died a king. Then there's Ivan VI of Russia, crowned as an infant in 1440. He never reigned. He spent his entire life imprisoned, a pawn in palace intrigues and coups. By adulthood, he had gone mad from isolation. He was murdered in his cell at 23, after attempting to escape. His legacy, a royal name etched on paper, a real life erased. And for girls, the burdens were different, but no lighter. Royal daughters were often engaged by age 6, not informally, formally, with treaties and signatures and painted portraits sent across borders to suitors they'd never meet until marriage. Some of these girls married into courts that didn't even speak their language. They were renamed, rebranded, shipped off like fine porcelain. Their job: produce heirs, don't cause problems. Pretend you love the man who treats you like diplomatic luggage. The Infanta Maria Theresa of Spain, who married Louis XV of France, brought with her a dowry so large it nearly bankrupted the Spanish treasury and a lifetime of silence. She bore the title of queen, but her husband had a string of mistresses and she was routinely ignored at court. Her letters hint at a quiet sadness, but her role was not to complain. It was to endure. Royal children weren't allowed to be soft or slow or simply young. They had to represent dynasties, validate treaties, remind the public that the bloodline continued, even if the child was sickly, stammering, or terrified of being touched. In many cases, they were physically unwell, a byproduct of inbreeding, high-pressure environments, and relentless expectations. But their illnesses weren't treated with sympathy. They were hidden, because a sick heir meant instability. A coughing future king could cause markets to falter. A princess with a weak constitution might lose her marriage alliance. And through it all, love, the parental kind, the emotional kind, often took a back seat. Affection was delegated to nannies. Encouragement came in the form of tutors correcting posture and grammar. The child learned early, you exist to inherit. You exist to represent. You exist to secure the past, not to explore the future. We like to romanticize royalty, castles, jewels, the weightless glamour of being born into legacy. But for many of these children, the crowns were too heavy for their tiny skulls, the titles too long for their learning tongues. The history they carried never paused to ask if they were ready. So, next time you see a miniature portrait, a child with sad eyes, and a scroll of titles longer than their lifespan, remember, behind every inch of gold was a body still growing, and behind every name carved into a throne was a child who never got to say no. There's something delightfully medieval about the phrase papal dispensation. It sounds official, holy, and possibly written in Latin calligraphy dipped in gold. But under all that flourish, it often came down to something much simpler and far more human. Marry your cousin. Just pay the church first. Because while the church publicly condemned consanguineous marriage, a fancy term for you share too many ancestors, it also quietly, repeatedly, and profitably approved it, as long as you had the right connections and the right coin. Let's rewind. For most of medieval Europe, canon law forbade marriages within 7 degrees of kinship. That's not just siblings or first cousins. We're talking fourth cousins, maybe fifth. The idea was spiritual purity, moral order, and avoiding tangled family alliances that looked a little too much like a loop.
Because the pool of suitable royal spouses remained small, the logic was airtight. Married within the bloodline to preserve power. Then spend the next generation arguing over which branch of the bloodline deserves more of it. You start to see the bitter pattern. Incestuous marriages led to rival claims. Rival claims led to cousin wars. Cousin wars led to dead heirs. Dead heirs led to desperate succession. Desperate succession led to more cousin marriages to consolidate again. It was a royal feedback loop of love, politics, and the occasional execution. So the next time someone sighs drearily over royal weddings, remember beneath the lace in Latin, many of these unions planted seeds of conflict. A cousin here, a cousin there. Add a disputed will, a papal dispensation, and one really ambitious duke, and you had yourself a war. Because in royal history, marrying your cousin didn't just keep the bloodline tidy, it also sharpened the knives. But while that was one corner of the past, another story was unfolding quietly nearby. If you've ever fallen in love with someone from across a crowded room and then done absolutely nothing about it, congratulations, you'd fit right in at a medieval court. Because for centuries, love among the upper classes wasn't about kissing or touching or even talking. It was about yearning endlessly, decorously, and ideally while looking like you hadn't eaten in weeks. This was courtly love, the social script of romance in medieval Europe. And it wasn't designed to lead to marriage, children, or even a polite flirtation over wine. It was designed to be beautiful and impossible. Let's be clear, courtly love was never about love as we know it. It was a performance, a stylized game of chivalric devotion that unfolded in poems, glances, sighs, and deeply coded metaphors. The knight adored the lady, usually married, often far above his social rank from a safe and uncomfortable distance. She pretended not to notice. He wrote songs about her elbows. This dynamic was considered virtuous, noble, the highest form of emotional refinement. Actual affection, that was for peasants. The rules were strict. A proper courtly lover never touched the woman he adored. That would cheapen the sentiment. Instead, he stared, often for hours. He might walk beside her horse. He might compose a sonnet about the way her veil fluttered in the breeze. But anything more? Treason socially, if not legally. In some cases, the lady didn't even know who her admirer was. She might receive an anonymous poem, a single rose, a sigh in the hallway. If she did know, her job was to appear aloof, encouraging just enough to keep him miserable. And misery was the point. Courtly love celebrated suffering. The pining knight, the unreachable lady. The aching heart turned into verse. To truly love someone in this framework meant to long for them without hope. The successful courtly romance ended not in marriage, but in poetic despair. The ideal lover was emotionally tormented, sleep-deprived, and dramatically thin. He didn't eat because he couldn't bear to. He wandered the woods composing lines like, "My heart is a bird impaled on the rose of your name." He might write that her glance was a sword and her words arrows. She didn't have to say much, just exist. From across a room in a beam of filtered sunlight. This wasn't an accident. In many medieval courts, particularly those in France, Italy, and later England, emotional restraint was considered elite. Physical desire was animalistic, but aesthetic suffering, that was culture. Some historians argue that courtly love emerged precisely because so many noble marriages were arranged. People needed an emotional outlet that wouldn't threaten inheritance or social structure. Courtly love provided a safe fantasy, a scripted passion with no consequences. It was erotic theater without the mess. Others see it as a tool of control. Keep the young knights focused on sighing at noble women, and maybe they won't pick up swords against the king. Let them burn with desire so long as they don't touch. The literature of the time reflects this beautifully and absurdly. In the 12th century romance of Lancelot and Guinevere, the knight rescues the queen, crosses perilous bridges, fights dragons, and then spends entire chapters not kissing her, because to do so too soon would spoil the sanctity of his devotion. In Andreas Capellanus' Art of Courtly Love, a medieval manual on how to pine like a professional, we're told that love cannot exist between husband and wife because it requires mystery and distance. Marital affection? Too domestic. True love was supposed to hurt. And it wasn't just men who played the part. Women were expected to embody cold radiance, unattainable, perfect, polite. Their best weapon was indifference. Respond too eagerly and the game collapsed. Hold back just enough, and your admirer would write 36 ballads comparing your silence to the beauty of a snow-covered chapel. But what happened if the lovers did touch, or worse, consummated their affection? Well, the poetry usually stopped or turned tragic. In fiction, they died. In reality, they might be exiled, punished, or married off quickly to someone else. The whole system depended on the romance never being real. There were, of course, exceptions. Secret affairs happened, illegitimate children were born. But these were scandals, not celebrations. They broke the rules of courtly love, which insisted that the best love was the kind you never acted on. And yet, people bought into it, not because they were naive, but because the alternative was so much worse. For many nobles, marriage was political, cold, negotiated. So courtly love became an emotional safety valve. You might be stuck with a partner you barely knew, but you could adore someone else in metaphor. And the metaphor could be beautiful, even if it starved you. There's something hauntingly modern about it. The idea of loving someone you can't have, of romanticizing suffering, of turning longing into a personality trait. Today we post quotes on Instagram. Back then they illuminated manuscripts. And what did all this do to people? It taught generations to equate distance with desire. That the more unavailable someone was, the more worthy they became. That intimacy ruined beauty. That love was only real if it hurt. It was, in many ways, a cult of hunger. Emotional, physical, spiritual. The perfect courtly lover was famished for touch, for closeness, for connection, and the perfect lady just out of reach. So the next time someone quotes a medieval poem about longing, listen closely. You're not hearing love. You're hearing a slow, elegant heartbreak, painted in calligraphy and served with a side of sighs. As in courtly love, the greatest compliment wasn't, "I adore you." It was, "I'll starve for you silently forever."
Medieval fabric. The pressure was enormous. Some brides took drastic measures, pricking themselves with needles, using animal bladders filled with dye. Others begged sympathetic servants to doctor the sheets. A few simply cried until their new husband agreed to lie for them. And what of the men? They were rarely questioned. A groom could stumble out drunk, muttering nonsense, and no one would ask for proof of his virtue. His experience, even with prostitutes, was considered worldly. Hers, if confirmed, was scandal. The hypocrisy wasn't hidden. It was enshrined. Even the church, which preached purity, turned a blind eye to noble men's pasts while scrutinizing women like walking contract clauses.
And it wasn't just about proving virginity, it was about ensuring paternity. A bride who wasn't a virgin could have been pregnant. A child born with uncertain bloodlines could disrupt inheritance. So the sheet wasn't just symbolic, it was insurance. This obsession bled into culture too. In folktales, the pure maiden trope reigned supreme. In legal documents, annulments were granted based on consummation or the lack thereof. Plays featured comic scenes about the bridal chamber, where jokes about proving a wife's innocence were met with raucous laughter. And if all else failed, there was the court physician. Yes, sometimes doctors were brought in to inspect the bride's body and offer a professional opinion about whether she'd ever had sex. No pressure. By the Renaissance, this system became more elaborate. In France, the cérémonie de la involved multiple people. In England, chambermaids whispered verdicts to the waiting family. In Italy, stained sheets were paraded through town. The worse the gossip, the grander the display needed to be. And what if the marriage fell apart? A clean sheet could be resurrected as evidence. She never bled, the husband might say years later to annul the union. I was deceived, and courts, all male, would listen carefully. Even today, echoes of the sheet test remain. The idea that virginity is something visible, measurable, and proven by paying persists in some corners of the world. The same logic, the same myths wrapped in different packaging. Because when societies want control, they often start with women's bodies, and nothing says control like demanding a stain to justify your existence. It's almost poetic in the bleakest way possible. A bride, often a teenager, wrapped in silk and ceremony. The weight of 2 dynasties on her back, told to smile, told to perform, told that her entire future depends on what soaks through a mattress. She was handed a dress, a veil, and a test no one could truly pass. So the next time you hear someone waxing nostalgic about traditional values, you might ask which part exactly, the pageantry or the part where love was measured in laundry. In the modern world, if your love life gets messy, you might lose a few friends or get awkward glances at a party. In medieval Europe, you could lose an ear or be flogged in public. Or, if your town was especially theatrical, get branded on the face with a hot iron like a misbehaving donkey. Because falling in love with the wrong person wasn't just scandalous, it was criminal. Especially if you were a woman, especially if you weren't rich, and especially if the person you loved didn't come pre-approved by your family, your priest, or your village mayor. Let's start with the branding. Yes, actual branding. As in hot metal pressed against human skin, till it left a permanent sizzling reminder that you, sir or madam, had dared to feel something forbidden. In many towns across Europe, lovers caught in illicit relationships, usually involving premarital sex, adultery, or running off without permission, were sentenced to public humiliation. Men might get a T for thief, or B for blasphemer. Women caught in carnal sin were sometimes branded with F for fornicator. Others got more creative shapes, initials, symbolic marks to indicate shame. And this wasn't some fringe rural punishment, it was institutional. In parts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, local courts, often run by clergy, handed out branding sentences like parking tickets. One misstep, one neighbor with loose lips, and you could go from secret romance to public livestock. The logic was harsh, but in their eyes, coherent. If love was a social contract, arranged, approved, and aligned with property rights, then unauthorized love was theft of honor, of dowry, of social order, and thieves had to be marked. But branding was just one flavor in a whole buffet of punishments for love. If a couple was caught lying together outside of marriage, the punishments varied wildly, by time, by place, and by how much the local bishop had eaten that morning. Sometimes it was a whipping, carried out in the town square to the soundtrack of jeering neighbors. Other times it was a parade, the lovers forced to walk through town, barely clothed, holding signs describing their sins. Imagine walking through your high school cafeteria holding a sign that says, "Touched her ankle after sundown." Now imagine it's your whole village and there's a pig farmer laughing at you. Some regions preferred financial penalties, a fine paid to the local authority, or, in some cases, to the woman's father as compensation for damaged goods. Yes, her body was considered a financial asset, and love was the crime that devalued it. And if the lovers were of different classes, say a nobleman and a peasant girl, well, that's where it got vicious. The woman was often accused of seduction, never mind the power imbalance. She might be banished, imprisoned, or publicly flogged. The man might get a scolding, or if the scandal reached the wrong ears, shipped off to a monastery for retraining in virtue. Nowhere was safe from this madness. In 14th century Florence, laws detailed punishments for dishonest touching, which included, we kid you not, smiling suggestively. In England, ecclesiastical courts could drag couples through lengthy investigations to determine whether they had engaged in pre-contract, an old-fashioned term for making romantic promises without parental consent. These weren't short affairs. Some trials lasted months. Witnesses were called, bed linens were examined, love letters were read aloud like evidence in a murder case. And while the church claimed to protect marriage, it often ended up punishing affection that wasn't properly notarized. And for same-sex love, forget punishment. Think obliteration. While male same-sex relations were officially criminalized in much of Europe under sodomy laws, women's relationships were often erased altogether. If discovered, they could be labeled as witchcraft, deviance, or moral contagion. Branding, exile, and even execution weren't off the table. The punishment for love was rarely about the act. It was about the defiance, loving without approval, without paperwork, witnesses, or appropriate social standing, was seen as a direct threat to the system. So, the system struck back hard. It carved shame into skin. It paraded people through streets. It turned intimacy into evidence and affection into a crime. And the stories, when they survive, are heartbreaking. There's the tale of Isabelle and Jan, lovers in 15th century France who were caught sneaking into the church at night to whisper vows. He was branded and sent to war. She was sent to a convent and never spoke again. Or Anna the weaver from a small German town whose only crime was being caught kissing another woman behind the dye house. She was fined, then whipped, then disappeared from the records entirely. No happy endings, just burn marks, silence, and erasure. And what did it all achieve? Power, control, fear. By making examples of those that stepped out of line, the authorities kept everyone else in it. Love became a performance, not a feeling, but a ritual of duty, family approval, and property consolidation. If you wanted passion, you better hide it. If you wanted affection, write it in metaphor. And if you wanted to survive, truly survive, keep your feelings off your face and your hands to yourself. Because in medieval Europe, the brand wasn't just metal, it was a metaphor. You are marked by gossip, by law, by shame, and sometimes, quite literally, by fire. Getting married should be the happiest day of your life, unless you had to do it while literally running for your life, whispering vows under your breath, and hoping no one heard you say, I do. Welcome to the world of medieval elopement, where love came with a footnote, proceed quietly or be publicly destroyed. Forget the flower petals and doves. Some weddings happened by torchlight and barns, or in graveyards, or in the back corner of a monastery with a half-blind friar who agreed to officiate only if you promised not to mention his name later. Because in many parts of medieval Europe, marrying without permission wasn't romantic, it was illegal. A rebellious daughter marrying a lower-caste suitor, that wasn't just family drama. It was treason against the property ladder. And the system. Ah yes, the ever-anxious system couldn't handle that. You see, marriages weren't just unions. They were infrastructure. They were treaties. They were financial mergers with veils. A noblewoman's womb wasn't just her own. It was a dynastic vault. And unauthorized access was treated like a break-in, which is why some couples had to vanish before they could say their vows. Elopement meant sneaking out during a festival,
borrowing a cousin's cloak, bribing the gatekeeper, and sprinting across the countryside like two fugitives from the Church of Respectable Marriages. And if that wasn't strange enough, the church itself kind of allowed some loophole wariness.